Great to see you, and thankful again for this opportunity we have together. We might ask you to turn to the book of 1 Corinthians. We've been studying 1 Corinthians now for some time, looking at this letter and its many interesting passages and trying to understand what it means. And we've come to 1 Corinthians 11, and there in 1 Corinthians 11 and in verse 1 beginning, Paul starts out, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the ordinances as I delivered them to you. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. And every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonoreth his head. But every woman that prayeth or prophesieth with her head uncovered, dishonoreth her head. For that is even all one as if she were shaven. For if a woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so is the man also by the woman, but all things of God. Judging yourselves, is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. But if any man seem to be contentious, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God." We began a study of this passage last week, and I'll not try to re-preach that lesson. It is recorded. You can go back if you care to and look and see what was said there. But in trying to understand this passage, there are some things that we glean from the opening statements. In the first place, it's striking to me that Paul here in verse 2 says, "Now I praise you, brethren." I think there's a contrast between what he's talking about in these verses and what he begins a discussion of in verse 17. As I understand it, both these passages relate to acts of the assembly, when the church, the whole church, comes together in one place. But he has some very negative things to say about other aspects of their assembly. Over in chapter 14 in verse 26, a passage we hope to get to not too long from now, in that passage, he doesn't use exactly the same language, but I think it's the same spirit when he says, "How is it then, brethren, when you come together, every one of you has a psalm, has a doctrine, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation." You ought to be doing things that are edifying. You're not doing what's right there. And then in verse 17 of chapter 11, when it comes to taking the Lord's Supper, you're coming together, but in what you're doing in this, it's for the worse, not for the better. But in chapter 11 and in verse 2, he doesn't seem to have words of condemnation here, but commendation. I praise you that you remember me in all things and keep the ordinances. That word ordinance in your translation may be tradition. It is a word which literally does mean to hand down, but I think the old translation got it right here. I don't think he's talking at all about things that have been handed down from men, mere human traditions, but ordinances, things handed down from the inspired men, from God through the inspired men to his people. So we start off by saying, I think what he's dealing with in these first few verses is something that they were doing generally well. But I think what he's going to do in these verses is give them a basis for what they're doing. You know, it's possible for God just to tell us, do this, I want you to do this. In this case, I don't want men to be covered. I don't want women to be uncovered. When you come together, when you pray or pray, I don't want there to be any other conduct than this. Well, you know, that's enough, but Paul goes on to tell us through inspiration, to tell the Corinthians something about what this means. It's a symbol, obviously, a symbol of what? And he's rather clear about that matter. We looked also at verse 3, but I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. That this idea of covering or not covering your head when you pray or prophesy in the churches of God, that this is really a symbol of your respect for God's headship order. And that a woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered does not show respect for God's order. And a man who would pray with his head covered does not show respect for God's order. And so it has to do really with the symbolism that deals with headship. And by the way, let me just make a point there. One question that I appreciate questions about this. I've told you before, I've been looking at this verse for a long time. It doesn't mean I know everything. It certainly doesn't mean in this lesson, in the last lesson, we're going to give you every answer. I probably don't know near enough answers. And frankly, I think it's fair to say we're not going to deal with even all the questions. But I'd certainly invite questions, and I'd be glad for you to do that, and we'll try to deal with that either privately or publicly as you see fit. But one question that came up was, are we sure that when he uses the term man here, or woman, in the text, that's not talking about a husband or a wife? Well, actually, the words that are used here in the original language, aner and gune, are words that can be translated in certain contexts, husband and wife. And I think maybe the ESV and maybe some other translations might intersperse that here. But I don't think there's any consistency with that. And I don't think that he's talking just here about married people. And this passage might be a good point to show that. When he says there that the head of man is Christ, does he mean just married men? Could we say the head of the husband is Christ? Well, he is, but along with every other man. I don't think that we can limit it to just married people. I don't think this passage will fit very well if we try to read it that way consistently. For example, the man is also by the woman. The husband is by the wife. That doesn't make a lot of sense. That's verse 12. No, I don't think so. It tends to maybe point people in that direction when you start reading about this idea of men being the head of women. Well, obviously a husband has a headship over his wife that's a very special headship, unique. That does not have the same force with any other man. That's granted. But I also believe it's fair to say that there is a general headship. We tried to make this point last time, and I'll not belabor the point, but in 1 Timothy chapter 2, for example, when you read there about the order of creation and how that affects the conduct of men and women together. 1 Timothy 2 and in verse 12, I suffer not a woman to teach nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. And then he follows that up, for Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Is that passage just applying to husbands and wives? Surely not. Unless we would accept the idea that we could have maybe a woman here preaching as long as she wasn't married, then these rules wouldn't apply to her. Well, of course they would. And of course they do. This is a general headship. There's a specific kind of headship between a husband and wife, but I think the passage recognizes a more general headship of God, Christ, man, and woman, not just husband and wife. So, we looked at that last time. We'll not belabor that point for now. If you'd like to follow that up more, please get with me. We were looking at verses 4 and 5 last time also. And we noticed how that the command that's here, the instruction that's here, involves a man being uncovered, a woman being covered when they are praying or prophesying. Now, there are some who take that to mean this is true about anywhere these activities might take place. My own view of the passage, for reasons I expressed last time, is that I believe that it's in the context of the churches of God. But be that as it may, we're looking at something that happens at a particular time. Now, one question that I wanted to deal with before we went too much further is, does this passage, this part of the passage in particular, does it specify a type of covering that must be worn or not worn, or is it simply saying be covered or be uncovered? You see the difference in those two. I didn't bring examples. I could have. I've collected a lot of material through the years. Maybe you have too on this subject. And every once in a while you read a fellow and he will say, well, I don't really believe the passage applies today, but I'll tell you if it does, let me tell you what kind of covering a woman's got to have on. Y'all don't do it right anyway. And then he'll go on to tell about how, well, it's got to be so big, it's got to be able to you ought to be able to take so much grain in it and carry it around. It's got to be a certain, I think, where are you getting all that? Now, I realize that some of the translations will use, instead of covered, a word like veil, but it means the same thing. None of them are pointing to any particular type of covering to be worn. Now, verse 15 specifies a covering, and we'll get to verse 15. But I might note with you that when he does use the word there, covering, it is a noun, but it's a noun of a different word family. It's not the same word here. We'll talk about verse 15 in just a moment. But in this passage, we don't even have a noun. We have verbs and adverbs. There's no place in this passage where he specifies a particular type of covering. I just would note that with you. So that if someone comes along and they try to say, well, it's got to be this, and it's got to be... One fellow would say, oh, it's got to cover the face. All kinds of specifications. Where do you get that? All I have in this passage is a requirement for a man to have something, not wear something on his head, a woman to wear something on her head. That's the way the passage expresses it. In verse 4, literally the idea of having, and then it's something is supplied on the head. Some of the modern speech translations, Good Speech, for example, in verse 4, any man who offers prayer explains the will of God with anything on his head. Or the New American Standard, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying. I think that indicates this is something that's worn and taken off, and it indicates that it's not specific. A man who keeps his head covered when he prays or prophesies. Every man praying or prophesying having anything down over his head shames his head. Something that's worn as opposed to being bareheaded. But that's as specific as far as I can tell that these verses would get. Look again in verse 5. The idea here for the woman being uncovered, we have an adjective, akatakalupto. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, it's a word that's used to describe, again, just the act of being uncovered, not a specific type of covering. Or in verse 7, again, the word cover is a verb there. Williams in verse 4, any woman who prays or prophesies bareheaded dishonors her head. That's as specific as he gets in this particular passage. Having, again, is a verb, or from the verb echo, to wear. And we could go into this at some length if we needed to. We'll refrain from that. But echo transitively, to have, to hold in the sense of wearing garments, wearing a sword. We know what it means there. And so it's fair to talk about wearing or not wearing something on your head when you pray or prophesy. He wears a covering on his head. I don't think that fits very well the picture of a natural covering that he talks about later in the passage. I think this is something that is situational, that he'll wear at a particular time, but it doesn't specify in this case what it is that he might wear or not wear. Something on his head, as the New Revised Standard Version says. Now, back to our text in verse 5. Every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is even all one as if she were shaven. So again, there's a message here. It sends a message of dishonor. It brings dishonor, in one sense upon themselves, and the other sense upon the spiritual head. A man who wears a covering when he prays or prophesies is going to send a message of dishonor, brings dishonor upon his spiritual head as well as himself, and likewise the woman upon her spiritual head. I might, at some point, I want to make this point. I've made it before. When I've taught on this passage, I think on one occasion we talked about it in terms of a spirit and a sign. I'll bring that up again briefly if you'll let me. I think this passage contains both. I think it contains the idea of a sign, but it's a sign of a particular spirit of heart. And so here we have the idea of a man who has a spirit of reverence for Christ. And he shows that by the sign of being uncovered. Here's a woman who has a spirit of reverence and respect for God's order of headship. Her spirit is that way. And then she has a sign by covering herself when she prays or prophesies. And a spirit and a sign are called to come together. I think that's the idea. Now, I'll tell you something. And God is the judge, not me. But I think it's quite possible that there may be good sisters. I believe I've known many of them who had a marvelous spirit. And they were as kind and as submissive and as respectful of God's orders as anybody could be. They did not have the sign. And I think it's possible that there are those who've had the sign who haven't had the spirit. I don't know. I just found this. I was looking through my file here. I'd really forgotten all about this. This is from a little bulletin article. For the young folks here, it used to be common that churches, even small churches, would print bulletins. A little, folded up piece of paper, usually 4 pages, in which there'd be articles that would be written there and announcements and so on. And I remember this situation. When I looked at it, I remembered. This goes back 30 plus years. Another state, another world, seemed like. And I remember this congregation. It was not too far from where we were at the time. I was not a member there. But I knew the fellow who had moved there. He was preaching there. But the fellow that used to preach there was still there. And he wasn't preaching, but he did handle the bulletin, okay? There's the little odd situation there. And it was obvious to me, after reading his bulletin, he didn't think much of the preacher that moved in. So one day, I got the bulletin, and it had on the back page there a little paragraph under the heading of suggestion. And it read as follows: "Our dear sister," and I won't mention her name. I'm sure she's long gone by now anyway. You wouldn't know her. "But our dear sister so-and-so asked that we mention in our bulletin that she would like to hear some preaching on the good women mentioned in the Bible. She suggested that the women are preached to often in a negative way, and she feels that the men need to preach to themselves sometimes, and she feels that there is a lot of positive that could be said about women, and she would like to hear it once in a while." How about that? I wonder what she meant by that. Well, I don't know if this woman wore a covering or not, but if she did, she ought to get her money back. And you can have that kind of thing, where you've got a woman who may have the sign, she may not have the spirit. Or you can have a woman of the best spirit, but she may, for whatever reason, not have the sign. My prayer is that we'd have both, men and women, matching up with the sign of this passage. But I wouldn't argue with you for a moment that without the spirit, the sign is of little value. It's more of a dishonest sign. So there are bigger issues here. That's true. Speaking of bigger issues, let me mention this, and I meant to mention it somewhere. Every once in a while somebody will say, well, I don't really think this is a big deal. It's only mentioned one time in the Bible. I've heard that for many years, and I know where they're coming from. But I would mention this to you. It's a dangerous way to look at it, I think. You remember over in Matthew 22, this is an unrelated subject, but I'm making a point here. In Matthew 22, it's one of the occasions when Jesus answers the question, what is the greatest commandment in the law? And everybody here, I trust, remembers the answer to that. What's the greatest commandment in the law? This is verse 36 of Matthew 22, if you want to read the law. "And Jesus said to him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is likened unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Somebody pointed out to me, and as far as I can tell, it's true. That expression, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, is found in Leviticus, I think it's 19:18. You know, that's the only time in the Old Testament those words are found. I'm not saying that the subject of love is not addressed in the passage. I'm just saying that phrase is found one time in the Old Testament. It's the second greatest commandment. It's one time. And what you and I would say is, the Lord says it one time, that's one time's enough. So I think I don't have the power to dismiss this as unimportant if the Lord said it. I may have misunderstood it. I may have missed it by a mile. But here's what I would pray for all of us, that we would look at this passage anew, make up our mind, and stand on what we find here. Not because Wes said it or because somebody else said it, but because we believe this is what God would have us to do. So I think the issues here are important, and I don't think any of us would argue against that. Now, back to our text. Paul there writes, it is all one as if she were shaven. If a woman were to pray, let's just give the example, uncovered, then that is as if. It's the language of comparison here. He's comparing a woman not covering herself when she prays, for example, to a woman being shaven and being publicly humiliated in that way. We're not talking about somebody, medical condition or even heredity, something like that. We're talking about, the idea of someone, you've probably seen, if you've read much of the history, for example, of the Second World War. In the aftermath of that, women in places like France or someplace like that, for example, when the Germans occupied the area, after the Germans were chased out, women who were seen as being friendly to the enemy were humiliated publicly, and one of the ways they did that was to take them and to shave their head publicly. You may have seen that. Pretty ugly business, pretty unpleasant, I'm sure, for the individual there. Goodspeed translates our passage, any woman who offers prayers or explains the will of God bareheaded, disgraces her head. It is just as though she had her head shaved. But notice the comparison in the passage. He talks about the shame of losing the natural covering, and then he talks about this act. And so he says they are really, in effect, one and the same as far as he's concerned. Here's a question we might ask to the godly women here and other places. Would you be ashamed to appear in public with your head shaved? What Paul says is the shame of one is the same as the shame of the other. And if one still applies, I think we'd have to ask, why wouldn't the other be still the case? Let me go to verse 6. If the woman be not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it be a shame for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her be covered. I don't think he's speaking here vindictively, that you take and snatch up people that don't agree with you here and take their hair off. That's not what I think he's saying. But I think, again, he's making a comparison here. To lose one might as well lose the other. But notice that also, just as, if you don't have the temporary covering when you pray or prophesy, you might as well also lose the permanent covering. If it's a shame to lose the permanent, and it is, verse 15 makes that plain, then it's also a shame not to be covered when you pray or prophesy. Beck's translation, an American translation, reads, but if it is a disgrace for a woman to get her hair cut or shaved off, she should keep her head covered. So again, the comparison, and if that still applies, then I think that speaks to us today in terms of our worship. Verse 7, I should say, 7 through 9. For a woman indeed ought not to cover, for a man indeed ought not to cover his head, for as much as he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of the man. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. So he's arguing here for his cause on the basis of creation and the order of creation. I want you to notice it's not custom he's arguing from. This is not a matter of custom. This is a matter of fact dealing with the creation as God has revealed it. These verses reveal the reason why man ought to be uncovered, the order of creation. Man is the glory of God, the woman is the glory of the man. What does he mean by the glory of? It's a good question. Here's the best that I can do with that. I think what he's saying is, man is the glory of God, in the sense that man, when he functions as designed, when he keeps his place and fills his role, he brings glory to the God who made him. He is a glory to God in that sense. And woman, when she fills the role that God has created for her, reflects to his credit and brings glory. She's a crown to man, just across the board, and certainly in a specific way when it comes to the marriage relationship. That's true. It reminds us, no doubt, of Proverbs 31. You couldn't find a better example than this, where her children rise up and call her blessed. And her husband also, he praises her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Now, favor is deceitful and beauty vain, yes, but a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised. But I'll tell you, I think we'd all agree here that woman blesses the world. She doesn't just bless her husband and her children. And so we can see the glory that comes when everybody takes their part and does their part and pulls their weight. I just would say, I'm sure you thought of this too. How much better would our society be if men were men and acted like it, and women were women and filled the place that they've been given that only they can fill? And just how much better would life be if we didn't have all the rebellion that we see around us in terms of how we even look at gender roles and what a man or a woman is. Paul reminds us that woman is of the man and made for the man. That comes straight from Genesis. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18. The Lord God said, it's not good for a man to be alone. I will make a help meet for him. Woman made for man. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 21 beginning, the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And the Lord took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from a man, he made woman and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. And so he says there is an order in creation, an order from creation. And so that's still true. And so why would the conclusion not be true? We pointed out a while ago from 1 Timothy chapter 2, I think we generally still recognize there's a difference across the board in the role that God has for men and for women, and I think this passage fits into that same picture. Let me get to verse 10. For this cause ought a woman to have power on her head because of the angels. The word power is the word exousia, authority. Sometimes it's translated. I think the different views of this, but the context in my mind and most people's mind suggests the idea of she has, as he's been talking about, a covering to show the authority that men have. Goodspeed translates it rather loosely, but I think getting to the point, that's why she ought to wear something upon her head, something to symbolize her subjection. It's not her authority, but it's the authority as God has given it. For this reason, a woman ought to bear on her head an outward sign of man's authority, Mr. Phillips puts it. So again, it fits with the same picture. There's a message that what you wear or don't wear in the assembly upon your head shows or has for those who see. Now, in this case, he says because of the angels. And there we find the great mystery of the passage, I guess. All through the years, I've tried to read different folks who have ideas about this passage. But it seems to me, and maybe your experience is the same, that when it comes to the angels and how they fit into the passage, it usually comes down to one of two ideas. Now, there may be others. Maybe your idea is a better one. But the ones that I've found usually revolve around either he's talking about holy angels. And holy angels might fit in the passage in terms of being witnesses or observers of God's people. So you will read Vincent's word studies. It's a word study dictionary. And he, commenting on the passage, writes, the holy angels who were supposed by both Jews and early Christians to be present in their worshiping assemblies. Several have a view like that. Jamerson, Fawcett, and Brown, because of the angels who are present at our Christian assemblies and delight in the orderly subordination of the several ranks of God's worshipers in their respective places, and outward demeanor and dress of the latter being indicative of that inward humility which angels know to be most pleasing to their common Lord. The idea is, again, because the holy angels observe men, and I think they do. Therefore, we do this in order to be pleasing and proper before the holy witnesses as well as God. That she might show reverence for the angels invisibly present in the religious assemblies of Christians. Mr. Thayer, commenting on or defining the word angels, just goes through several of the passages where angels are used in the New Testament, and he has that comment about 1 Corinthians 11. Maybe that's so. Another view is that he's referring not to holy angels, but to evil angels. Look in Jude, the 6th verse. You remember Jude, verse 6. That's where Jude talks about God's judgment. And he says there, Jude, the 6th verse, the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, under the judgment of the great day. Reminding us of a rather sad story. One translation, modern speech translation, renders that first part of verse 6 this way. The angels did not stay within the limits of their proper authority. So a sign of authority with a view in mind of those angels that did not keep their proper authority. And maybe that's the case. Or maybe there's another view. But here's the point that I might make in passing, and others have made this as well. Whatever we think about this passage, angels still exist. I think it's the passage in Luke 20 and verse 36. The Lord reminds us angels do not die. And so whatever it was, because of the angels, I think that's as true today as it was then. And so I think the lesson, the power of the point would be the same, to follow what Paul calls for us to do. Now verses 11 and 12, I think Paul goes back here to verses 7 through 9 and some of the things he said earlier. 11 and 12 read in the old translation, nevertheless, neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. For as the woman is of the man, even so the man also by the woman, but all things of God. And so he's been talking about how it was true enough that woman is made for man, that woman is of man. Yes, that is true. But we also understand that the way God created the thing, we are mutually dependent upon each other. Because the truth is that you don't have men without women. That's just the way God made it. And ultimately, each is indispensable to the other for our existence. Ultimately, the human race depends upon men and women, and all depend upon God. So I think this is a passage just to remind us we're not going so far as to say one is inferior or one is worthless. No, all have a place. As we tried to say in the first lesson, there's no more shame in a woman being subject to man than there is Christ being subject to God, or man being subject to Christ. We have an order here, and we respect God's order. And I know the world has their own ideas, but the world is lost and half lunatic. So we don't really worry too much about that. We are concerned, all of us here, I know, are concerned about what God thinks. And we believe He has the way. All right. Verse 13 now. Judging yourselves, Is it comely that a woman pray unto God uncovered? Modern Speech Translation reads, judge for yourselves, is it fitting for a woman to pray unto God bareheaded? What Paul seems to be saying is not, hey, you decide. It doesn't matter to me. Just judging yourself. No, of course not. What he's saying is, after all I've said, now judging yourselves, is it comely for a woman to pray unto God uncovered? I think I mentioned this last time. I'll mention it again briefly. You'll notice he doesn't mention prophesying here. Because I don't think the point ever was, there are two acts, and these two acts are the two acts. I think that it's always been a part for a whole. What all goes on in the churches of God, when the church comes together, the whole church, to function as the church, whether that's prayer or prophecy or whatever it might be. Here he just mentions prayer as a part for the whole. But what he said is, judging yourselves, is it comely that a woman, he gives the example, pray to God bareheaded or uncovered? Well, it reminds us, at least to me, of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We looked at this recently, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 14. Paul has had a lot to say in chapters 8, 9, and 10 about the dangers of idolatry. And then he writes in what we call 10:14, wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as wise men, judge ye what I say. Well, that doesn't take any force off of the argument he's made. He's just saying, with all of this in view, now you think about it. You tell me, what's right about your cozy relationship with idolatry? It's not right. So I don't think that this passage at all brings it into the realm of just a coin flip or judgment, or you decide and it doesn't really matter. He talks about the comeliness, what's fitting. But he's given us the reason to show what he knows to be fitting and what would not be proper. And I'll just make this point in passing that even today, I think in reference to men, it would not be difficult to find a sense of uncomfortableness. If we had a fellow come up here and he was going to, for example, preach to us or lead us in prayer with his head covered, I think most people would say, well, that's not appropriate. And I think they would be right. But I think for deeper reasons than just it would be abnormal. Now, let me get to the last couple of verses here. Verse 14. Doth not even nature itself teach you, that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him? He brings up the word nature. This is also an important word in the passage. Phusis, I think, is the word. It's used a few times in the New Testament. Mr. Thayer says about the word in this passage, it is the native sense or the natural sense, the native conviction or knowledge, as opposed to what is learned by instruction and accomplished by training or prescribed by law. The native sense of propriety. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 14. That's really interesting. If he's right about that, I think it's pretty clear what we're talking about is not the covering he's been looking at in the previous part of the chapter, because that's something that certainly was commanded, that was instructed. That was a part of the ordinance given to them. But we're talking here about something that's just, it's the native conviction. It's the same word that's used over in Romans chapter 1 and verse 26. When he talks there about, there's certain, lesbianism is not new. It's been around a long time, and it's always been condemned by God's law. And in Romans chapter 1 and verse 26, he talks there about how that God gave them up to vile affections. The women changed the natural use to that which is against nature. We know what the word nature means there. It's not a custom, that's for sure. Just a custom? No, hardly. And he's not saying that it's not prescribed by law in the ultimate sense. It is condemned, but he's saying there's something fundamental about this. Even if you didn't have the law of God, you'd know this is not natural. And so I think when he's speaking here, he's talking about men having long hair as being unnatural. And it's disgraceful. I like what the old Methodist commentator, Mr. Clark, said about it years ago. He said, it's truly womanish to have long hair, and it's a shame to a man who affects it. A man ought to look like a man. He ought not to try to look like a woman, even though he may have all his little girlfriends tell him how cute he looks while he's doing that. It's not the right way to go. And I think all of us know who that's supposed to be. I think it's an abomination that we take Christ. I don't know what Jesus looked like in his earthly form. I don't know. I don't think he looked like a woman. And I don't think because of what we read that he would have thought that was the appropriate way in order to be. What Paul would say about that is, and certainly Paul would have lived in the time of Christ, is that he recognized it as unnatural and a disgraceful thing. And social styles certainly might put the pressure on us to go in another direction. I just offer this thought in passing, because I do think this is relevant. Be careful that we do not, and I'm speaking to young folks here and those not so young, but especially our young folk, don't be susceptible to self-deception. Where, for example, a fellow says, I'm letting my hair grow long, and then somebody say, well, what about this passage? And then I say, well, who knows what long is? Well, you just said it. I'm getting my hair cut off short, lady said. And you say, well, long hair is the glory. Yeah, but who knows what long is? Nearly everybody knows what long is. The thing is, I may not know exactly, and I don't, how many inches and where exactly is the line, but everybody knows long and everybody knows not long. So if God calls on me as a man to have not long, I put it right there where it's not long. And there won't be a question. And if God calls on me as a woman to have long hair, then as best I can, within the genetics that I have, I can make sure that it's going to be away from the line. There won't be any question about what we're doing. And we can keep our hair at a length that is no doubt acceptable to God or whatever God calls for us to do. Verse 15 reads, if a woman have long hair, it's a glory to her. Very different than a man. It's a shame for a man. A glory for a woman. Her hair is given her for a covering. Let me deal first of all quickly with the idea of glory. The word glory, a doxa, that which brings splendor, that which brings honor, that which brings praise. It's used several times in the New Testament, and we'll not take the time we might, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it's used of the glory of the planets, the glory of the heavenly bodies. In 2 Corinthians chapter 3, the glory of the old law and the more glory of the new law. In Hebrews chapter 9, he talks about the glory of the cherubim that were carved there as a part of the mercy seat. He talks about the glory of Solomon, but it's surpassed by the glory of the flowers of the field that God has made. And then he talks about, Matthew 25, the glory of the Son of Man when he comes back in order to receive his own. Now that's the word that's used in our passage to describe the glory of a woman's hair, the long hair, as a glory to her. Long hair may go out of style with men. It does not with God. And people who are educated by this passage and care about this book, and I know you do, and I hope I do, we keep that in mind in terms of our choices and our conduct. Now, let me deal quickly with this point, because this certainly is relevant. That long hair is given her for a covering. Parabolion is the word there. And it's a different word than the verbs that were used earlier, different family of words, not katakalupto, but parabolion, a different, I think, type of covering. It's a part of, again, a natural covering, a constant covering that God intends for a woman to have and for a man not to have. This natural covering is used as a comparison. If you recognize, if nature teaches you this, then you ought to remember this when you pray or prophesy. So, is long hair the only covering? This is a view that some really bright folks have taken through the years, people I respect very much as Bible students. And I can see the appeal in many ways of this view, but I have never been able to accept it for several reasons, two primary reasons that I'll mention. though I appreciate many things about it. And we would agree on a number of things. I think it falls short because long hair can't be the only covering of the passage. It is a covering. But it can't be the only covering because of the language of comparison. According to this view, to say a woman is uncovered would be another way of saying she does not have long hair. I think that's fair. I think that's a fair representation of this view. So try to read the passage with that in mind. And you have Paul saying, if a woman does not cover her head, that is, she does not have long hair, because the hair is the only covering of the passage. If a woman does not have long hair, she might as well as not have long hair. And when you read these verses over and again, I think what you find is, if you take the long hair as the only covering, you don't have any basis of comparison. You can't compare one thing with itself. I think you compare one thing with another. A natural covering with what he's talking about, something you wear. And something you wear when? The other point is that it's a situational covering he's arguing for in verses 4 and 5 and 6 and so on. Every man who covers his head when he is praying or prophesying. And for me, I think about that and I say, well, long hair is certainly a covering for a woman. But there would be no need for Paul to say, have long hair when you pray or prophesy. If that's the only covering of the passage, then the whole idea of wearing it when you worship would be pointless. And I say that with all kindness. Because that's all the time. That's not just in the assembly or just when you pray or prophesy, wherever you are. Wear something on your head when fits the passage. Have long hair when you pray doesn't seem to follow. A lot more could be said about that, but that's the basic, maybe, reason and something for you to consider and to challenge me on as you see fit. Let me go to verse 16 finally. I appreciate your kind attention. But verse 16 reads, if any man seem to be contentious, the old translation says, we have no such custom, neither the churches of God. A couple of things stand out here. One is this idea of contentiousness. Contentiousness is not a virtue, is it? You know, when Paul says contend for the faith, that's very different than being contentious. Contending is fighting. There's a time to fight. But here's the idea of loving fight, loving strife, quarrelsome, argumentative. Somebody who objects to object, objects unreasonably. That's the idea, I think, in the New Testament. And it's not a virtue, as I said. It's a vice. And so he calls on us, in this passage, he calls on the Corinthians to be concerned about some who would be contentious. And he said, I want you to know that we have no such custom. What custom? What practice is he talking about in this passage? I believe the answer to that is it's the practice that the contentious man is contending for. Paul's not surrendering his point. What he's telling the Corinthians is, I want you to remember, this is what I teach and what the churches teach, and if anybody comes in teaching something else, he's out of step. Not me. He's out of step. Some of the modern translations read, if one is inclined to be contentious, we have no other practice than what Paul is talking about. Neither the churches of God, nor have the churches of God. This is how things are done in all God's churches. And that's why none of you should argue about what I've said. What I've said is the practice of the churches, and what the contentious man's bringing in is not acceptable and should be dismissed. If anyone is disposed to be contentious about it, I, for my part, recognize no other practice in worship than this, and neither do the churches of God. As one paraphrase reads, some people may still want to argue about this, but we and the churches of God don't accept what those people are doing. He does mention the word custom in verse 16. And I think there are some who have from that decided that, well, this is all about a custom, and a local custom has no application to us today in any practical sense, and so it's really, we can just dismiss it as a custom. And there are those who will go to some length to talk about how that, yes, this was the Corinthian custom. You know what I've found is, though I'm not suggesting those folks can't find some sources, but I can find plenty of sources that would disagree with that. This is from Robertson, and his word pictures the New Testament. The Greeks, both men and women, he says, remained bareheaded in public prayer, and this usage Paul commends for the men. But this wouldn't be what Paul's talking about, wouldn't be the custom of just the average Greek, because he says men and women were bareheaded. That's what Robertson said. So he couldn't be arguing for a local custom, maybe half of it, or Expositor's Greek Testament. Paul's instructions do not agree precisely with current practice. Jewish men covered their heads amongst the Greeks. Both sexes worship with uncovered heads. Doesn't fit any local custom that these folks would know of. Among the Jews, the heads of both men were covered. In the synagogue among the Greeks, men and women were uncovered. The testimony of the assembly in this respect was therefore incidentally a token of separation from unbelievers, both Jews and Gentiles. Vine makes the point this is different from anybody's custom in the whole practice. So it's at least not a universal agreement that this was an ancient custom at Corinth. It seems the opposite to be true. But I think regardless of that, what's striking to me, and one reason why the custom position has not been able to take hold with me, though, again, some smart folks believe that and teach that, is I just don't think that Paul ever argues from custom. Think back on what we've looked at. We'll close with this. Does this teaching apply today? Well, is the order of spiritual headship still true? Or is that just a custom? Well, of course it wasn't just a custom. Well, does the lack of a natural covering still bring shame to a woman, the natural covering? Well, I think all would say yes, clearly. A woman would not want to have her head shaved and be paraded around in public. That would be shame. Still applies. Not just a local custom. Is a man still the glory of God? Is woman still the glory of man? Yes, we would say yes. Is woman still of the man? Yes, obviously the order of creation still applies. Is woman still created for the man? Yes. Are there still angels? Whatever, yes, they're still angels. Is the practice of the ancient churches still instructive to our practice? Paul said, you need to get in line, that contentious man does, with the churches of God. We all want to be in line with the apostolic church, don't we? Yes. Well, then it seems to me we're not dealing with just a custom, because these are the arguments that Paul used to call on the Corinthians to continue to keep the ordinances he delivered them to us. Well, we didn't say all we wanted to say, but we probably said enough. If you have a question, again, I hope that you will share that with me, and I promise to be as kind in my attention as you have been to me. I thank you very much for your kind attention and your consideration, and I pray the Lord will help us all to find what's right and to please Him. Okay, if you haven't already, please take your songbook out and turn to the number that's been selected. And if you're here tonight and you'd like to obey the gospel, or maybe as one who is a child of God, if you'd like to come back to God, I know the Lord longs to receive you. We'd love to help you. And we offer this invitation, this opportunity now. Won't you please come while we stand, while we sing.